As long as Friedrich Nietzsche is allowed to create dichotomies within Greek mythology that never historically existed in the minds of the ancient Greeks, I think I should be allowed to do the same thing. And I think I should be allowed to do it because I've noticed a very good analogy in relating to modern journalism nowadays, and that is once there was the Apollonian and Dionysian, and now I'm going to argue that we have the Tiresian and the Hermesian, or the Hermetic. Now, Tiresias is the hermaphroditic prophet of Thebes who advised about 7 generations of the city's kings, and he was changed into a woman by Hera for 7 years for killing a pair of snakes. Coming across another pair of snakes, he was transformed back into a man for, depending on the myth, killing them again, or choosing to leave them alone. He was also blinded by Athena in one myth because he accidentally came across her bathing naked, and in compensation she gave him the ability to talk to animals. Tiresias is a famous myth for the sex change and for his prophecies, his ability to contact divine sources of knowledge that other men couldn't. He was made famous, I think it was The Wasteland. Yeah, T.S. Eliot. That's right. The man and the woman. Anyway, the myths that we've got about him are all contradictory and fragmented, so there's not much more to say about him in isolation. I think you already know Hermes. Among his many other roles, thieves and travelers and messengers, gods in the ancient Greek model had tended to have limits in pantheistic models. There are boundaries that they could never cross. Hermes can't give messages except through human speech. Meanwhile, Tiresias is fluid. He's able to cross between the ultimate divide, the divide between people, because he's both a man and a woman, and he can contact sort of prophets, divine sources of knowledge, contact the dead. This is the dynamic between them, the Tiresian and the Hermesian. To understand the difference, a quick reference just to Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's Beetle in a Box is the thought experiment, wherein there exists a society of people who possess a creature seen only by themselves in a sealed container. They can never understand the contents of anyone else's box. They have no way of knowing if the beetle inside the box is the same creature as what they've got in their own. So it's obviously a metaphor for the internal experience. Emotions, if you like. And Wittgenstein used it to demonstrate that language is entirely cultural, it's intangible. Meaning that is shared is not necessarily the same meaning. Now, my point in making a dynamic of a dichotomy that some might call a false dichotomy between Hermes and Tiresias is that Tiresias switched sexes, so he's able to see the beetle in somebody else's box and really understand another person's internal experience because he literally became a different person, a human being, physiologically, mentally. Everything was different about him, but he still had the same memories. He didn't have the same brain. And Tiresias is distinct from Hermes because the god can't do that. So despite being privy to all of the messages in existence and, delivering the messages and sort of knowing everything from the top down, he can't understand it intuitively in the same way as someone who's experienced it. He's got knowledge of it all. He doesn't understand. He's more like a digital database than a browser of that same database. Tiresias understands what he knows through at least 2 sets of eyes, which means that it has more meaning for him. We'll talk more about that later, though now is not the time. Maybe if I applied antifragility, that would explain it better. Tiresias is anti-fragile. Confronted with sudden, unwanted womanhood, he adapts, he gets over it, he improves. She, or he, it, she has kids and lives for 7 years until Hera changes her back. And when Athena blinds him, she also gives him the ability to talk to birds. The gain from disorder is pretty obvious there. There's one way to look at it, but you could also say he was anti-fragile because none of the information he received as a seer was enough to stun him or to put him out. Tiresias' pre-existing idea of life didn't include the idea that he was supposed to know everything like Hermes and have domain over a whole sphere of existence in the world, so things that surprised him didn't disable him. He is a singular adaptable unit, anti-fragile. Whereas, if you confront the god of communications with a communication method he doesn't expect or unknown information which is alien to him, his position as the god of it all is challenged because that's supposed to be his thing. Hermes is big, he's all-encompassing, he's very vulnerable, he's very fragile. Time to talk about journalism, because that's where our best example comes from. Early journalistic practice, and now we're getting into the history of this thing, early journalistic practice, as practiced during the Protestant Reformation, consisted of the distribution of millions of propaganda flyers, denunciations, praises, everything in between was circulated by whoever was interested in whatever agenda all the time. There's no MEAA, there's no industry code. If you had a printer and if you had a person to use it, you could publish whatever you liked. Now, there were hundreds of independent operators. I'd call that system anti-fragile because it allowed the readers, although of course there were very few people at the time who could read, the number was growing, to read panegyrics from different sources which wildly disagreed very easily, and they make up their own minds. Like Tiresias, a tiny socialist primer understands the mindset of the traditionalist newspaper because they're at the root the same. Modern journalism, as in the large mass media type, in fact I really shouldn't say modern journalism, I should say mass media. Mass media I would not call anti-fragile, especially since a massive number of newspapers and official sources are owned by Rupert Murdoch, meaning that if he fucks up in some manner, they all follow suit. Like Hermes, he owns everything, but he understands so little of the information that his papers carry in a human way because he's got that hermetic or Hermesian, preoccupied Olympian, from the top down understanding of it that precludes a natural understanding. Then there's the idea that a tiny socialist pamphlet or a tiny little website like the Daily Wire or some such thing creates new content. It's publishing the results of the endeavors of its creators, like, say, a rally. It's small, it makes no pretense at objectivity. Like humanity, it creates, while the Murdochian or the Hermesian newspaper can only report on what's already there and add spin. Because pantheistic gods all have their individual sort of realms, they can't make anything, they can't expand, they can't change. A tiny independent newspaper can. It's got the freedom to act, and it's got the freedom from industry codes to be original. For all the complaints of the Greeks about the rule of their old gods, they were wise enough to acknowledge that they, as smaller units lacking responsibility, had those very freedoms in contrast to those gods. Journalism of the future, and we're seeing this already because people are calling newspapers and mass media legacy media, will be an ongoing debate between anti-fragile outlets, small, independent, mobile, and intelligent units, as Robert Fripp called them, because the internet has forced people at large to be that way. I'll expand more on journalism generally later, this isn't the time for that either. So, now what? Are we going to live in a future where journalistic outlets are pitted against each other in a bloodless war for cultural capital against the larger structures of society? That may sound pretty dramatic, but it's essentially what's already going on, and you've probably noticed it yourself. People are too thinly spread out for general impressions and general applications to actually apply to all of us. A case in point, the mainstream mass media doesn't report on lots of what happens to most people. Interests, hobbies, fields of study, they've diversified and fractalized into pieces so small that formal education at the lower levels is so far beyond what's actually being discovered in sort of research institutions and labs that there's almost no point even trying to keep up. Only universities are able to keep up with what's going on. The world's digital, but nothing's connected except on a personal level, where one researcher personally knows another researcher, and so on. Things fall apart, the center can't hold, people are disenfranchised by the established media, and they've been exposed to so many bizarre and characterful cultures, or fetishes, by the internet, that they feel as though the mainstream culture is just too uninformed to support them in what they do. There's too much to cater towards in one society that's as large as ours now is, particularly one that isn't very erudite anymore. Well, maybe it never was, but that's an argument for another day. The solution, or rather the inevitable conclusion, is digital city-states. In the ancient Greek model, city-states were united by common passions and fears which transgressed class boundaries, as is evident by the universal turnout for the playwrights like Aristophanes, Euripides, and so on. Passions and culture and common interests are what unite us. The internet is not a new phenomenon in this regard at all. It just allows for previously unimagined combinations of intellectuals and hobbyists, specialists, fetishists, in any field to talk to each other. There was a sense in older societies, and this is going to sound like a generalization, I know, but I still feel like it's the right thing to do to say it anyway. There was a sense in older societies of knowing somebody's neighbor, and feeling pretty safe in a city which is now gone due to the large numbers of people refusing to engage with the world immediately around them, the high amount of immigration around the planet compared to the rates from the 50s, and the increased suspicion people have of strangers as a result of a lot of cultural changes that would take too long to explore here. The West cities are filled with strangers. And combined with the lack of cultural cohesion, that fractalization that I described earlier, this fact is leading people to naturally make more friends with common interests online, and they're ignoring their physical environment. In other words, what we're seeing is the formation of digital city-states. We've already seen it, actually. 4chan and Tumblr consider themselves different tribes. There are subcultures within those tribes. People united by a common culture flock together and form tiny groups, differentiating themselves from the outsiders by virtue of this shared interest in a given thing. All real cultural movements have to start on the fringe, with the fetishists and the obsessives, and they move slowly to the center, and as they move closer to the center, they become exponentially faster and they become larger. Jordan Peterson spent decades on the fringe as a complete unknown in the field of clinical psychology, who wrote one book on how people created meaning that only about 12 people read, and all of them were fellow psychologists. That lasted until 2016 with the Bill C-16 controversy, then he started moving. His jumps towards the mainstream, as I can recount them, were the following. He started uploading Maps of Meaning lectures to YouTube, while being interviewed by several major figures after the Bill C-16 thing. Although those figures relative to the center were still on the fringe. They're like Dave Rubin. He took part in the Cathy Newman interview, which was ridiculous and disastrous. He released the 12 Rules for Life book, and now he's been interviewed by the ABC in Australia, and I can find copies of his book at the local Dimmicks. So, it's exponential, of course, but it's also a good example of something that starts on the fringe and only very gradually gains the capacity to make it towards the center. Every proper cultural movement begins in the fetish, and it does that because it's essentially Tiresian. It's blinkered. It's separate from the amorphous, hermetic mass of information that is quote-unquote everything else. If it begins in the center, it's a forced me, and it'll either be plugged and consumed by the masses, as much of a fedora tipper as I sound there, you have to admit that I'm right, or it'll quickly die out and it'll be replaced with no one noticing. Examples, top 40 pop music. But real cultural movements, things that change the status quo and things that have merit and attention paid to them by people who pay attention to things, always begin on the fringe of the culture with a fetish. I will now try to predict what is going to happen to the media in the future. I do wonder how long it'll take before someone uses the phrase that I've just made up, digital city-state, and the idea becomes mainstream, and the auteurs and the passionate hobbyists who make video essays and online lectures become more popular than the academies they learn from. And then perhaps they form a unifying board and come up with some certification, and they become a serious challenge to the established order, and eventually they supersede it. Digital city-states functionally run the Western world in a cultural sense. Everyone in a digital city-state knows everyone else, and they hold one another accountable by virtue of shared knowledge. BookTube, AnimeTube, video essay people, Tumblr, 4chan, everyone in an online community is able to vouch for or castigate everyone else based on personal experience, in a very similar vein to ancient Athenian radical democracy. We're already at that point. Now, there are a lot of metaphors comparing the internet to the Wild West. By far the best is Chris Ray Guns, but it's not the Wild West anymore. The unexplored, lawless new world. Now the internet is more like 7th century Athens. It has this primitive, as yet uncemented, and newly codified set of cultural laws. We've moved forward in time, independently of outside forces. And now we've divided ourselves into city-states, dispersed enough that we need sets of individual cultural practices and rules to regulate participation in this thing, whether that be BookTube or the video essay bunch who have no collective noun. When I say we need laws, I don't mean YouTube has to start regulating the content, because please God, no. I don't even really mean we need it as much as we already created it by virtue of sharing a common standard of video quality. So, A video essayist's videos are expected to support a hypothesis with accurate and relevant evidence, and an anime YouTuber is expected, but not required, to use footage of whatever he's talking about in whatever video. It's not that humans naturally make laws as much as we do conventions, naturally. So, where is, and do we really need, a Solon? Where is the lawmaker who comes from within, the Tiresian lawmaker who's seen it from the inside to stand against the Persian invaders, as this extended metaphor calls the advertising companies and copyright claimants? Who is our Pericles?